Yeah, I mean, prevention is like this weird, like, I thought it was like voodoo. It's like you can't quite put your finger on what prevention is, but you also know what prevention is not, right? It's
Yep.
it's so hard.
It's one of those things like, where they say like, you can't define it, but you know it when you see it kind of thing. It's like one of those.
Yeah.
But I actually think, in this space, this translation, this sort of riffed on it here, this phase 3, phase 4 stuff. I actually think this is kind of where it's right because we're not actually used to thinking about prevention for heart failure as a entity. We're really good at thinking about treatment for heart failure, right? HFrEF is less than 40% for drugs, whatever, 5 pathways. But
Yeah.
we're not necessarily in tune, that lexicon doesn't really exist. It exists in atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease because we have primary prevention statins,
Yeah.
really.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think it's going to require a fair amount of education and a fair amount of really thinking about how to frame prevention
Mhm.
for heart failure. So it's really going to be an implementation problem, even if the trial is successful. So it's actually kind of a fun area where I'm starting to say like we really need to think about phase 4 stuff now.
Yeah.
What's the burden? Well, how do you bend the curve? It's sort of building that story up front.
Yeah. It's super interesting. I mean, hello, welcome, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the world. This is the Study Success Blueprint. Hello and welcome. My name is Matthew Mace. This is the Study Success Blueprint. I have with me today Ankeet Bhatt, who is a associate physician at Kaiser Permanente in the San Francisco Bay Area. He is also a adjunct professor at Stanford University. Thank you for joining me.
Oh, thank you so much for having me today.
We start every one of these podcasts talking about what is jazzing you today in your field of medicine.
Oh, great question. Well, I think we're starting to see the intersection of technology and clinical care and clinical evidence generation come to a head. I think, we've been limited previously by technical expertise. Now that technical expertise, I think, has grown quite rapidly over the last few years. And now I'm really excited about the translation of that technology to clinical care and to our evidence generation ecosystem. So that encompasses all of the sort of ML models, the impact that AI may have on the way we deliver care and democratize care. So, I know it's kind of been a buzzword, but I'm super excited about what that, how we figure out how to translate the tech to healthcare.
Yeah, no buzzwords needed. But I mean, you work across academia, you work across like real patient care, and collaborated with industry folks and also the FDA, right? Like, how well is that all working together?
I've been in this unique position to be able to kind of see the ecosystem from a care delivery lens, from a academic lens, and then have had collaborations with both regulatory and industry. And, I'd say there are clear areas for innovation, particularly around the way we conduct randomized clinical trials, both in the interventional space where there's a lot of constructs, but also in the way we embed clinical trials into routine patient care. And that's obviously been something that folks
Mhm.
have written a lot about. But I would contend to say that it's been relatively unrealized in
Mhm.
most health systems, at least across the US. And so I do think there's a huge opportunity to do that, sort of meld research with operations in a way that gives you definitive answers but also allows successful strategies to be sort of incorporated into a standard of care, at least locally.
Someone brought this up in the cancer world. Research is the standard of care almost, right? Do you think there's a pathway to do that in cardiology and in your field?
Yeah, I think that that's a really apt comparison. And as lots of folks have written about the correlates between cardiovascular disease and cancer in terms of morbidity and mortality. I do think there is that potential, but we've got a long way to go.
Mhm.
We've got to sort of think about our framing of the disease state because in cancer, once patients get a diagnosis, they often are the ones that are empowered, engaged, seeking out clinical trials. rather than only getting it passively. And I think in cardiology, at least, most of our trials come from providers and systems to the patients rather than the patients sort of seeking them out themselves. And so I do think we have some responsibility around that to engage patients more deeply, for them to understand sort of the gravity of these kinds of diagnoses and the associated morbidity and mortality. But that I think is a laudable goal, and probably a good standard bearer for where cardiovascular clinical trial innovation may go.
How did you get into research? How do you bring research to your patients like this day and age? Is it still like you knew a guy who had a nice device and wanted to do a trial, or, like, is it a little bit more sophisticated now with the networks you have?
So I've been super lucky. I had the chance to spend some time and train at places that were doing really high quality research, both in residency and fellowship, and got access and got to learn from people who were doing clinical trials on a very high level. But y- understanding that access may not exist for most people, I actually think that there's a lot of ways you can get involved in research early on. So part of it is really just taking a look at your patient panel and trying to see what kinds of trials and things that are out there and where they might fit. And now we've, to kind of bring it back to my first point, is we've got all this technology that can help you. And I've got friends basically that are using technologies in which they can upload protocols and develop patient lists that may fit those inclusion exclusion criteria. So some of those barriers and some of that sort of activation energy, I think, will dissipate over time. Now, those technologies haven't been rapidly and really ubiquitously employed yet in health systems, but I do see a future in which that is happening. And I think it'll actually bring down the barriers to participation in research, because it can be a little daunting to think about it. How does one get started?
How is Kaiser Permanente set up in San Francisco? What's that process like? Did you have to bring research there? Was it already established, and where do you see it going?
Yeah. So we're really lucky. The system in which I work is an integrated healthcare delivery system, serves very large population, over 4.5 million members in Northern California, and a very diverse patient population. And so that's really been a wonderful base in which we can use for recruitment. The other really nice thing was that I joined the organization about 2.5 years ago. They've have a very well established division of research and accompanying clinical trials program that serves all of these 4.5 million members from a centralized infrastructure. What that's allowed our system to do is, in many cases, particularly for some pragmatic studies, is to centralize the resources for clinical trial recruitment and follow up and retention and call centers. And that's really, I think, allowed us to accelerate our participation in clinical trials. The other piece that I think is a really unique value add from our organization is that because it's an integrated healthcare delivery system, the data we have really high fidelity longitudinal data on most of our members. And that's allowed us to use the electronic health record in some cases for endpoint ascertainment and SAE reporting and things like that. So I think it's actually quite a unique system, and one that's really powered to lead the way in terms of operationally embedded and clinically focused research in the future.
I guess that is the advantage. It means, the alignments of research and care all match up. Explain to me and explain to everyone else, what is implementation science to you, and is that anything different to good quality care?
I became interested in what I'll broadly call implementation and care delivery science as a trainee, because I saw that my mentors and people that I really looked up to were spending a lot of their research time trying to bring new drugs and devices to market, and conducting large scale phase 3 randomized clinical trials, and doing that very successfully. And I became disappointed in the fact that those innovations had a relatively slow diffusion to usual care. So implementation science is really the study of strategies and methods that help bring evidence-based care to practice in ways that are equitable and that can be done at scale. Now, that's kind of an operational definition of it. The way I like to think about it is it's closing the gap between what we know and what we actually do.
Mhm,
And so it's got lots of parallels to things like quality improvement. Where it differentiates is that there's a true rigor in terms of the evaluation component. So
mhm,
they're often studied in randomized clinical trials where we're testing one strategy against a usual care strategy. The reason I find it so compelling, especially at the health system level, is that if you have a successful strategy that you've kind of thought through from the beginning forward, so you've gotten stakeholder alignment, you've understood the unit economics of it, you can understand how to scale it if it's successful in a pilot. Then you have the chance to take that last mile and implement successful strategies very, very quickly. And then you have an ever improving standard of care. So the gap between discovery science and what we see in practice is actually mitigated when you start to do implementation science interventions, because those can be rapidly scaled because you've already done a lot of the work to figure out how to scale it if it works. So yeah, we've been fortunate to use the integrated healthcare delivery system and some of our collective knowledge and interests to conduct some implementation science interventions across our ecosystem and others, really aimed around trying to bring evidence based, guideline concordant care to patients in a way that can be done at speed, can be done in a scalable fashion, and can be done equitably.
mhm. And what's the metric that you set yourself, like, when you're doing implementation science? Is it the percentage of diffusion of technology? Is it, hard outcomes, endpoints? Is it the quality of life, or is it variable based upon the technology you're evaluating?
Yeah, you're hitting all the important points here. So I have lots of feelings about this, but there are some established frameworks that look at implementation science from a scientific rigor standpoint. So one would be the REAIM framework, which talks about the components of implementation science. Is it reaching the patients that you want to reach? Is it acceptable to patients? Is it what is the implementation paradigms? What does maintenance of this intervention look like? However, to your point, I think that there's some interesting facets of implementation science. So certainly I think to move guidelines and move clinical care to the extent that you can incorporate clinical outcomes in addition to the implementation outcomes. So medical therapy uptake plus quality of life plus clinical outcomes. I think that has the greatest chance of putting implementation science at the level of evidence that's required by guideline committees and others.
Mhm,
So I do think that that's important. Equally important is, I think, what I'll call sort of the process and implementation metrics. So how expensive was this to put together? Which parts of the implementation science intervention can and cannot be automated? What's the people time look like? Does it affect length of stay? Some of those important facets, because one, that helps you communicate that to health systems and to your health system
mhm,
leaders for rapid sort of incorporation of these strategies. But it also it gives you a sense of what I'll call, quote unquote, the cost effectiveness of a strategy. So we're used to thinking about cost effectiveness in terms of drugs and devices, but we also need to think about that in terms of our care strategies. And so it's more than just looking at clinical outcomes.
like, stupid question alert. Like, how does implementation differ from, like, a registry study, for example?
Mm. So registries are really nice because they collect routine care. Now, where there's been a relative dearth of evidence is, can we test care strategies in the context of a registry? A registry tells us what people are doing today, but often, and with a few notable exceptions, we don't really test new strategies within that. What implementation science says is, okay, we know what the standard of care is. There's lots of gaps in these certain metrics. For example, prescriptions for heart failure medical therapy. Now, there's a billion ways to potentially make that better. Let's pick one or two and test it in a way that we get a definitive answer. So if we're going to be testing a clinical decision support system, let's implement that in a randomized set of half of providers, or in a stepped wedge design, or in some sort of clinical trial. So that way we can get a definitive answer about whether the strategy works, how effective it is, the absolute uptake of therapy, and whether that uptake is maintained over some period of time. That's much harder to do in a registry because you can see secular trends. You can see maybe SGLT2 inhibitor use has gone up, but you have no idea why. You're not sure what the strategy was or whether this was just diffusion over time.
Yeah, got you. Over the years, anything that really stood out that surprised you about how technology is diffused?
There are a few points here that I do think our ecosystem needs to think about a little bit more. So the first is that we're very used to a stepwise thinking in terms of new therapies. But if you kind of zoom back and say, whoever's investing in a new therapeutic is making a bet. And they're making generally a pretty large bet. They are spending a good amount of money to take a compound or a device or some sort of strategy from an idea
Mhm.
to a approved product in wherever you live. What we often forget is, or what we do too late is think about the what I'll call the phase 4 signs. So we spend a lot of time on the phase 2, 3, and then we celebrate the success, and then we say, okay, now we got to go figure out how to get it to patients.
Yeah.
What I would love to see happen is have alongside an executive or steering committee, either having representation from people who have interests and expertise in implementation and care delivery science, or in parallel, developing a smaller implementation science steering committee that can help to inform the phase 3 to phase 4 science. Because if you're making a bet on a drug or a compound, you're already assuming that that it's going to work. Now, you may be disappointed if it doesn't work, but you're already thinking that it's going to work. And so,
Yeah.
why not start to plan for phase 4 around the same time you're planning for phase 3? That could be protocol development and making sure the protocol is one that if beneficial, can be easily implemented. It's also just around, what's the real world evidence strategy that we need to employ? What is the types of follow-on implementation science studies that would help to inform how this is actually going to be delivered in practice? So that's my hope and hopefully my vision at some point.
Is there any standouts? So like, don't have to name names, but like, where this has been done well in recent times?
It's still maturing from that phase 3 to phase 4 science. Where I think the implementation science has really done well is actually a lot of the European countries because they have a lot of structural advantages similar to integrated healthcare delivery systems in the United States. They've got a closed population that they can follow longitudinally. They've got a rich electronic data warehouse that they can query for both inclusion exclusion criteria, but also endpoint ascertainment. They usually have ways to communicate with patients and citizens, and so, a notable example is my friends in Denmark who've done a lot of really good implementation science work across really therapeutic areas, all the way from vaccination to chronic kidney disease and others. And they've done it at scale and they've done it rapidly. And I think that kind of ecosystem, that rapid randomized clinical trial ecosystem, is what you need in implementation science because you can't spend 10 years perfecting an implementation protocol, then implementing it, and then hoping it diffuses. It needs to be done much more quickly than that.
Yeah, I mean, healthcare does have a shorter cycle, and it's I don't know whether you see it some of the students at Stanford or any other the early stage companies you deal with. I think we we plan how we're going to do the pivotal trial. Oh, the commercial launch will just be later, right? And
Yeah.
it's a bit of a backwards thinking step. When you're engaging with an early stage company or engaging with junior colleague who wants to bring a trial to their hospital, what sort of advice do you give to them when they're planning their journey?
So to follow on that thread a little bit, when you're developing a new technology, a new innovation, a new whatever, focus on the ultimate goal. So the ultimate goal, generally, at least when I talk to most early stage companies, is to change clinical care. Okay. And so, most people don't say, well, the goal is to get this drug approved by the FDA. It really means they want to affect people. And so kind of have that as your anchoring point. And then I think this idea of melding phase 3 and phase 4 makes a lot of sense, right?
Mhm.
Like we've only accomplished half of our mission if we get to the phase 3 part of it and sort of think about that in the ecosystem. Second is also when you're developing a new technology and you're starting to try to look at clinical trial sites, understanding their motivations, I think, can be really important. So there's a lots of different sites out there. Some are very interested in the academic and brand potential of being at the forefront of innovation. Some are using this as something to bolster their business. Some are very interested in the academic potential output of that. And and sort of trying to get an understanding of what makes people tick from a site perspective, I think can be quite helpful. Sometimes I've seen some companies sort of take a one size fit all approach to all sites. And you have varying levels of academic interest, of academic experience, of other wants that make you want to or not want to participate in a clinical trial. And so I think matching that a little bit better, or even just being upfront and asking, what do you hope to get out of your participation in this trial, can actually make it a more beneficial experience for everybody.
Yeah, it's it's funny you say that. It's sometimes like a guarded game, like we're trying to figure out what everyone wants, but, I'd rather say like, "Yeah, Ankit, like, what gets you what gets you excited about a trial?" And might as well ask that question now, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, look, I come from the perspective of somebody who spent a lot of time in academic medicine and really identify as a clinical trialist and a clinical investigator. And so, for me, it's really a couple things. One is that, does this technology have a place in my clinical practice? Because I think that I'll probably be a better PI if I can sort of see the vision of how this might affect patients that I see. That's one. The second is really, what is sort of for me the academic potential, I think is what gets me really engaged. That not only are we going to have the chance to bring this new therapeutic potentially to market, but also we're going to learn something both along the way and even after the trial is completed. And so, the ability to have the potential to be participate in some of the publications or on the study leadership, I think is what drives me. And it gives me the opportunity to sort of have that creativity to start to think about the trial much more deeply. So but that might not be, sort of what everyone is hoping to get out of a trial. Some people might just want access to a certain therapeutic for their patients that they
Mhm.
feel like is missing. So, I think it is important to really try to understand that from site by site level.
Yeah, I found it very variable, and you know what? There's not a right answer, right? There's not a right answer to why you do trials. Maybe whether it's a colleague or a student or whatever, like if someone comes to you and says, Anki, I really want to get into clinical trials, like where do you tell them to start?
Mm. I think this is really important. Sometimes people want to sort of say, "Okay, I'm interested in clinical trials. I want to lead some clinical trial." Well, that's awesome, but just like anything else, there's sort of an apprenticeship and a practice learning that happens over time. One of the most beneficial things that I had the opportunity really to do was enroll patients in clinical trials. And I did that, even as early as when I was in residency, and it actually gave me a real appreciation for like some of the real nuances of clinical trials. Like, how do you communicate an informed consent? How do you talk to a patient about the importance of clinical research and what they or what the cardiovascular community in this case might benefit from their participation? How do you input information into a case report form? Some of these things that we really take for granted when we look at the clinical trial at as a holistic entity, but it's pretty nuanced, right? Like how you ask a question might vary the answer you get. And so I don't think there's any substitute to doing it. And so, if you're a student or someone, a trainee or an early faculty member just trying to get your feet wet, I'd say, find people at your institution who have enrolled in clinical trials and done it successfully and ask if you can maybe be part of their next clinical trial as a co-investigator or as somebody that's sort of helping out on their study team, and just go through the process of enrolling. And I think you'll get a deeper appreciation for sort of the nuances around clinical trials. And then I think it'll guide you to if you wanted clinical trials being a bigger part of your professional life thereafter, you'll at least have the base for how to do that.
Yeah, so it's start where you are at, start and unfortunately you have to put the work in because you don't know what you don't know, right? I think is the phrase. You have to you have to try before you can run.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, sort of being that like, armchair clinical trialist, I think it's less effective when you haven't sort of done some of the grassroots things to really understand it. And so, yeah, that's what I would say is sort of important as you're starting to think about clinical trials in your professional life.
And just switching it slightly, over to the like very macro level, you engage on a national stage thinking about trials and thinking about implementation and thinking about working with the FDA and and other organizations, where can they do a better job to help clinical trials? And back to your earlier point, like how to get clinical trials part of routine care.
There's a lot of different things, we could talk a lot about that. Part of the challenge is that our healthcare system is really not designed for integration of clinical research into clinical care. Now, there's a lot of people doing really good work in this, both in US and otherwise. So not to say that no one's doing it, but I would say as a whole, we're not designed to do that. We in many cases are incentivizing more widget-based work
Mhm,
or sort of RVU-based work rather than holistic care. But if you think about it, once you incentivize holistic care, then things like implementation science, new therapeutics, et cetera, become much more easy to integrate into an ecosystem. I think that will get better. Two is that we have thought about implementation and care delivery science on a system by system basis. So I might be doing something here. My colleagues across the street at UCSF might be doing something quite interesting there. Often, once we compare notes, we're all sort of thinking along the same threads, which is always fun. So I think from a cardiovascular community, we need to start to think more cohesively about implementation science, not as a one-off QI in my system, but as something that can provide definitive class 1A recommendations for how to best implement these therapies. And so that what does that mean? That means we need to do bigger trials, not necessarily more expensive trials, but bigger trials that are more representative and have a central strategy that's being tested. To do that, we need support, of course, from funders. And so, to the extent that industry and governments and foundations want to support that work, I think, and continue to support that work, I think is really, really important. And it's good for them too, because it provides definitive evidence about an implementation strategy. And if those strategies are then incorporated into clinical practice guideline documents or guidelines or other things, then they have a really compelling message to providers, payers, health systems that you really need to do this. This is part of the evidence base, just like the therapy is part of the evidence base. So that's a long-term goal, probably. But I do think that once we start to think that way, and it gets back to a little bit of that melding between phase 3 and phase 4. If we sort of say phase 3 is done, now throw it across the fence and let's let the commercialization be the commercialization, I'm not sure we'll ever get there. But if we're
mhm.
planning for a win on phase 3 and starting to think about how we're going to best get this to patients early on, we have a better chance of doing that.
It's not hard, and it's also not easy, right? It's this joined up approach that needs us to be open and a little bit more communicative. And I think you hit the point. I don't think academia does it alone or industry does it alone. Like there is this melding of minds that has to happen. You know, what's your hope for the next couple of years of how we can either come closer together or just find a better lane to work together?
We need to start to develop better networks for implementation and for clinical trials. So networks that can take a protocol, adapt it to their local infrastructure, and be able to deploy it at speed. I actually think there's a lot of these that exist in the globally, but more cohesion I think will be helpful. Then we need to start to think a little bit more holistically in terms of disease state. So, we've been pretty focused on cardiovascular disease. It's obviously a big disease, affects a lot of people. But as there's been an increasing appreciation that metabolic related diseases, kidney related diseases, and otherwise all contribute to cardiovascular morbidity and mortality and are probably pathophysiologically similar. We're starting to see that because a single therapy is now affecting multiple axes across CKM health.
Mhm.
So we need to start to collaborate better with other specialties who are thinking about clinical trials and really kind of open our minds to a new ecosystem. And then I think from an academic standpoint, we have leverage to be able to put forth bold, larger, bigger ideas because now you're not only dealing with the cardiovascular community, but the renal community, the metabolic community. The potential market size is really large. The potential total addressable market is very large. And so I think that will drive some innovation from both regulators and from industry and other funders
Mhm.
to think about funding big programs.
We can only hope.
Yeah, that's right.
But I really appreciate you taking the time with me. There's like 1,000 other questions I wanna ask, but obviously, you have a day job, so I'll let you get back to that. But, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, Matthew, it's always a pleasure, and it's great to chat with you, and hope to see you very soon.
Yeah, that sounds good. I'd like to thank Ankeet for joining me today. That was enjoyable, fun conversation, looking into the world of implementation scientists in an integrated care model. Really fascinating. If you like this, please like and subscribe at wherever you normally listen to podcasts. Go ahead, listen to our conversations from 2025 and look forward to a bunch of new conversations with some fantastic researchers and innovators in 2026. So, with that, I can leave you today. Speak to you very soon. I've been Matthew Mace, and this is the Study Success Blueprint. This is like randomly gross. Does KP make it easier to do implementation, do you think, than an RVU based site?
So, in some ways, it makes it harder. In some ways, it makes it easier. So, it makes it harder because you have to do a ton of work up front to get the thing going. You got to get like a billion sign-offs, and is this person on board and that person on board? It's can be painful. If you identify as just a pure, straight up academic person, it can be painful.
Yeah.
The good part is that when you trudge through all of that, you can make something go at a scale that you just can't. It would be very hard to do in another system. So, like, a good example was this trial called KP Vaccinate. So we, we spent a lot of time engaging with operational leaders. But then once they kind of bought in, they were like, yeah, we can randomize 3 million people in our system. And you're like, whoa, okay. Like,
Well,
we were thinking like, okay, maybe do 15,000 or 20,000, whatever, and we thought that was big. But so the reach is really cool,
mhm,
and you can make them believe that the impact is going to be really important for their system, versus you get less questions around, is this gonna hurt our views? So in
yeah,
some ways it's better. It's just a little bit more work. And I actually think that for the kind of stuff that, for care strategies and implementation, stuff like that, it is probably the right way to do it, right? It's probably not right to just be testing random things that you have an academic interest in that don't really have health system value or buy-in. So it's painful at times, but it's probably the right way to do it.
fair.
Sounds good, man.
All right, appreciate it. See you
All
soon.
right. See ya.